Hello everyone, it's Hoplite Mike. I hope you're all doing well. Today I'm back with some more Middle-earth Total War Remastered, and I'm kicking off the faction overviews with Gondor. Just bear in mind, everything here is technically a work in progress, although this is likely what Gondor will look like on initial release. I'm not planning on making any material changes from this point. And the way it's set up now is very much how it was intended to look in the original version of the mod released some 15 years ago. He starts with 13 regions in total, which spans all the way from Caer Andros and Minas Tirith in the east to the Anfalers in the west. And your religion is naturally, of course, good. In future versions of the mod, I do have some ideas about how I want to develop Gondor. I think the way it's set up now, with a large starting territory of about 12 or 13 regions, takes away a core Total War gameplay aspect of, starting small and growing into a massive empire. I think when you start with such a big territory, that element of progression is taken away because the job is sort of already done for you. So I'm looking at ways to remedy that, and one of the things I'm looking at is splitting up Gondor into its various sub-realms. So for example, you could have these outland regions split into the outland realms of Gondor, and then their objective could be to expand west. You could break off Dol Amroth into its own faction with the objective of going south to attack Harad, and then you could potentially look at splitting off, Ithilien or the region of Arnor. I mean, the objective is basically to get to a point where you're starting with a couple of regions for each faction, and then that allows you to grow into the game, as opposed to starting with a massive territory. The other, probably more interesting way of doing it is to set up Gondor as a super faction. So just like the Roman factions are set up in the base game, with Rome as the capital owned by SPQR, and then 3 different Roman factions which go in various directions, you could split up Gondor in a similar way. So Minas Tirith would effectively be your Rome equivalent as the capital, and then you might have the Outland Realms, the Southern Realms / Dol Amroth, and then the Realm of Ithilien, and then each faction sort of goes its separate direction under the command of the overall super faction, which is Gondor or Minas Tirith. But that's just something I'm thinking about. It's probably a long way from actual implementation, but it'd be interesting to hear everybody's thoughts in the comments. First things first then, your faction leader is Ithilien of House Hurin, and he has a son called Denethor, who is of course Denethor from the Lord of the Rings films. In the original mod, Faramir and Boromir don't appear, but it's something I was considering adding in, just to give it a bit more immersion. I mean, they wouldn't have been born at this point, but you could still add them in as kids. In terms of your general models then, so this is how your generic Gondor generals will look like. So every general that spawns in after the start of the game will look like this, and they will also have the Steward's Guard cavalry bodyguard unit. In the original mod files, Gondor actually has, but only has 2 named characters, and I think that might have been an error because there's several generals which are listed which I think were meant to be named characters, so I did bring in a couple of them. The first is Damrod the Hunter. He has a custom model. He's basically the Ithilien commander model, and he has a custom bodyguard unit being the Ithilien Rangers, as opposed to the Steward's Guard. We go over to Dol Amroth. There's also a custom general here, so Adrihil. He has the Swan Knight model and has the Swan Knight's bodyguard unit. So your custom bodyguard units, they're essentially a one-off general unit. Once these die, you will lose them forever. So if you are fond of your custom generals, bodyguard units, then try and keep them alive if you can. So that's all your named characters. I will look at bringing in some more in the future, but for the initial release, that's going to be everyone. So in this section, I'm going to cover the economy. I'm going to keep this fairly short because Gondor has Númenorian culture, which basically gives them access to the best of everything. They get the highest tier of farms, traders, ports, and then I think they get tier 1 of the mines. So essentially, once you get some money invested into your economy buildings, you won't have any trouble making money. But as you can see, top tier of the trader, top tier of the farms, top tier of the ports. You're also one of only 2 factions which gets the full 3 tiers of the road, so it'll be quite easy to transport troops to the front line. In terms of mines, Gondor only gets access to tier 1 of the mines, but there's very few regions in the game where you can actually build mines. It's just places which have gold or silver, and generally that's just where the dwarves reside, but you shouldn't have any problems making money anyway. So yeah, I will leave it there for the economy. There's not too much to say on that, and I'm going to move on to military. In this section, I'm going to discuss how recruitment works. Gondor is largely based on an area of recruitment system, so there's various units you can only recruit from certain regions, although there is then your professional army units which can be recruited from most regions in the core Gondor provinces. So the way that works in the game files is that each region is assigned hidden resources. So Ithilien, for example, has got hidden resource Ithilien, and that means you can then recruit Ithilien units from this region. So just going through each of the units and buildings one by one, the first thing to note is that your government building gives you access to the Gondorian militia. So to be able to recruit Gondorian militia, you need that region to have hidden resource men, and I've given nearly every region in the game hidden resource men because I don't want the player to be in a situation where they can't recruit units from a settlement, or they're too far away from a settlement that can. The regions which don't have hidden resource men are generally those inhabited by orcs, goblins, elves, or dwarves at the start of the game, but nearly everywhere has hidden resource men, so you should always be within reinforcement range. That brings us on to our 3 key recruiting buildings, being the barracks, stables, and the missile range. The barracks being where we get our core infantry units. There's only 1 unit you can get from tier 1 of the barracks, and that is the men of the Outland Fiefs, but you can only get them from certain regions. So if we go to Lond Gallen, tier 1 of the barracks, we will find men of the Outland Fiefs. In order for a barracks to give you access to that unit, the barracks must be located in a settlement which has hidden resource outlands, and that's generally those in this area here: Andrast, Ruwaith, a couple of regions centrally, and then another few in the north here around the Andren. But they're intended to be early game troops you can get on the outskirts of your territory, but they're not very strong. In terms of tier 2 of the barracks, there are 2 units you can get from tier 2 of the barracks. The first being the Warriors of Peneth Gelen from certain regions, and the second, assuming you have the right hidden resource, is the first professional army unit, being the Gondor Spears. So I'm going to touch on the Warriors of Peneth Gelen first. This unit's quite similar to the Men of the Outland Fiefs unit in terms of where you can get it and how strong it is. So if we go to tier 2 of the barracks in Peneth Gelen, you will see the Warriors of Peneth Gelen. And in order for a barracks to give you access to this unit, the barracks has to be located in a settlement which has hidden resource hillmen, and the regions which have that hidden resource are quite similar to the ones which have outlands, which is just these regions here, a few out this way, a few centrally, and then a few in the north around the banks of the Andrin. But again, the Warriors of Pinnith Gelen are just an early game unit that's supposed to represent the different fiefs of Gondor. So going back to tier 2 of the barracks then, let's have a look at the Spearmen of Gondor, which is your first professional army unit. So in order to recruit the Spearmen of Gondor, the barracks must be located in a settlement which has hidden resource Gondor, and that's basically all of your starting territories, some regions in the south here, and some in the north as well. But hidden resource Gondor effectively gives you access to your professional army, so that's likely what you'll be focusing on as you move towards the mid game. In terms of tier 3 then, there's only one additional unit you get from tier 3, which is the Axemen of Lossarnach. So if we go to Arnach, in tier 3 we find the Lossarnach Axemen. So you can only get these from 2 regions, which is Arnach and Pelagia. But again, these are essentially fiefdom units, and you'd probably rather be using the professional army units, but they are a nice inclusion nonetheless. Okay, so tier 4 of the barracks, and this is where things get more interesting. So tier 4 of the barracks gives you your Swordsmen of Gondor, and that's in the places which have hidden resource Gondor that we went through previously. Importantly, at tier 4 you also get some of the Dol Amroth units. If we go to the city of Dol Amroth, we go to tier 4 of the barracks, you'll find the Dismounted Swan Knights and the Amrothian Men-at-Arms. So if you're a fan of Dol Amroth, then the tier 4 barracks is the one you want, and that gives you access to your swords and spears of Dol Amroth. And you can only get those Amrothian units from this settlement. In the future I might expand that slightly, but for the initial release that's how it's going to be. Okay, so the last tier of the barracks only gives you access to one more unit, and that is the Winged Guard of the Citadel. If we go here, tier 5, we'll find the unit, and you can only get this unit from Minas Tirith, from the capital. This is your most elite infantry unit. So that is a rundown of the barracks and what units you can get and from where. Okay, so next we move on to the stables. Tier 3 of the stables in Dol Amroth gives you access to the Swan Knights, but there's still no recruitable Gondor cavalry unit outside of Dol Amroth. That is remedied somewhat by the fact all of your general units which spawn in after the start of the game will have the Steward's Guard cavalry units, but it does mean you're a bit lacking in the cavalry department and that you can't really recruit that many. We'll see how things go with the initial release. If it becomes a problem, I will change it fairly quickly. So the last recruitment building then is the missile range. There's only one unit you can get from tier 1 of the archery range, and that is the Bowman of Blackroot. We go to Eric, the practice range, you'll find the Blackroot Vale Bowman. And these are actually very strong archers, they're just a bit lacking in the defense department, but plenty of missile attack on them. the Blackroot archers can only be recruited from 3 regions, being Dol Amroth, Eric, and Colamba. In terms of tier 2 of the missile range, that gives you access to your ranges of Ithilien from the regions of Ithilien. So the only regions where you can get those are from Emyn Arnon, Caer Andros, and Minas Tirith. But again, pretty strong units. Gondor is not lacking in the missile department. In terms of tier 3 of the missile range, this is where you get the Archers of Gondor. So these are recruitable from all regions which have Hidden Resource Gondor, which is just all your starting regions and then some more in the north and others in the south here as well. So that's about it for recruitment. I think as you progress through the game, you're probably going to rely on the professional army units, but some of the archers you can get from Blackroot Vale and from Ithilien will do the job just as well. I have deliberately designed it so that you'll only really be able to get the professional army units from your core regions and some just out with, but given you have tier 3 roads and you also have access to the Gondor militia from almost everywhere, it should still be, a reasonable challenge, and that's the way it's intended to be. So with that being said, I'm going to move on to the units on the battlefield. In this section, I'm going to run through the units on the battlefield. The Gondor roster is well-rounded, with a particular focus on strong infantry, although it also incorporates some decent archers and strong but limited cavalry options. I've divided the units into their various subgroups. First of all, we have the early game troops, mainly comprised of fiefdom units. Up next are the professional army units, which are intended to make up the bulk of your armies for most of the campaign. The Winged Guard of the Citadel are your elite soldiers, and the Blackroot Vale Bowmen and Ithilien Rangers are the additional ranged options. Up next are the Swords, Spears and Cavalry of Dol Amroth, and the last unit there is the Steward's Guard, which is Gondor's generic bodyguard unit. So having run through the roster at a high level, let's go through each unit one by one. First up, we have the Gondorian Militia. This is essentially Gondor's variant of the Town Watch. They are the weakest unit on the roster, but the one big advantage they do have is they can be recruited from almost anywhere. So if you can't get your stronger troops to the front line, then you should still be able to recruit some of these units to at least slow the enemy down. Following on from the Gondorian Militia, we have the Men of the Outland Fiefs, meant to represent the hunters, herdsmen and fishermen of the outer territories of Gondor. These are a fairly decent upgrade on the militia in that they have +3 defense, but they are still mainly suited to support roles. Then we have the Warriors of Pinneth Gelen, meant to represent the men from the Anfala's region. These guys wield an axe as opposed to a sword, and they are significantly better than the Men of the Outland Fiefs, because while the attack only goes up by +1, morale goes up significantly to 22, so you're able to place a lot more reliance on this unit. But I would still be wanting to move on to the professional units as soon as you have access to them. Then we have the last so-called early game units for the roster of Gondor, being the Axemen of Losnar. You can see they are the first unit on the roster to wield a double-handed weapon, and as such they are much more offensively minded. The melee attack of 8 is up there with even elite tier units, but the total defense of 9 means they are quite vulnerable to ranged fire. I'd say having a couple of units would be beneficial to have on the flanks, use as shock infantry, but I wouldn't be putting them in the front line. Up next, we have the 3 professional army units, which all share a similar design: the Gondor swords, spears, and archers. Their stats are in line with what you'd expect. They have a decent unit size, high defense, excellent morale, and a reasonable attack. These are intended to make up the core part of your forces as you move through the mid to late game and can handle most opposing units. That brings us on to our elite infantry units, the Winged Guard of the Citadel. They're one of the best units in the mod, superior in nearly every way to the Gondor swords, and boasting an almost unbreakable morale at 30 and high defense at 18. Their attack stat is only slightly above average at 6, but their charge stat at 10 means they can still do significant damage. They can only be recruited from Minas Tirith, so the intention is that the player will only be able to recruit this unit in limited quantities. The Athelian Rangers and Blackroot Bowmen are both regional units. They're actually superior to the Gondor Archers in terms of missile attack and range, but the lower defense stats means they won't hold up as well to opposing missile fire, cavalry charges, and they're not as capable in melee combat. But if you're just looking for that pure archer performance, then certainly worth having these units in your army. The other thing I wanted to point out as well is that the Athelian Rangers actually have a custom commander model as well, which is here. They're just kneeling down, but if I move them about, you can see them. Next up, we have our 3 Amrothian units: the Dismounted Swan Knights, the Dol Amroth Spears, and the Cavalry. The Dismounted Swan Knights are slightly different to the Gondor swords in that they don't have a shield, they just wield a 2-handed sword. So as you might expect, they are invested in offense as opposed to defense, but still an all-round excellent unit. Something to note as well is that they do have a slightly lower unit size than the Swordsmen of Gondor, but I would still consider them to be an elite unit in the roster. Then we have the Amrothian Men-at-Arms. In terms of stats, they're very similar to the Spearmen of Gondor, and bearing in mind you can only get these 3 Amrothian units from Dol Amroth, I would rather be using that recruitment slot to either get the swords or the cavalry, because the spears are not that much better than the Spearmen of Gondor. Then we have our last Amrothian unit, the Mounted Swan Knights. There's not too much to say about this unit, it's basically excellent in every department, so if you need a cavalry unit to do a job, then this will basically fill every role. And last but not least, we have the Steward's Guard, which is the bodyguard for every general which spawns in after the start of the game. This is actually not as strong as the Swan Knights, but a more than capable cavalry unit. So that's going to be it for this Gondor preview. If you're interested in the mod, please join the Discord or subscribe to the YouTube channel. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you on the next one.